Happy Festivus.
It's Festivus.
When George was growing up, his father...
Nothing. It's nothing. It's a stupid holiday my father invented. It doesn't exist.
Happy Festivus, Georgie.
Hey, Vinny, listen.
I never heard anything like this in my life. Listen to this.
This is exciting! This is exciting! Huh? Did I miss anything already?
Kramer, get in!
Where's the crazy man?
Hey! Sit down. Come on, it's about to start!
It's a Festivus miracle.
That's right, Vinny. We recently spoke with Peter Mehlman, acclaimed writer, classic writer, like legendary writer of Seinfeld. Brilliant writer, one of the original 4 writers of Seinfeld. Peter has written a book called It Won't Always Be This Great. You've probably heard about it. He recently, I think, wrapped up his book tour, right, Vinny?
2-month book tour. And now he's home for the holidays, and he was nice enough to sit down with us for an hour. And we got to pick his brain on his career, his start on Seinfeld, meeting Larry David, as well as some of the notable eps that we all know and love, such as The Implant, The Betrayal, The Sponge, The Masseuse. So, and he gave us some nice little insight to being part of this show that we all love.
I was expecting maybe to sit down with him for about half an hour, and he was nice enough, as you said, to give us a full hour. So I can't say enough nice things about Peter Mehlman or his writing. His book, It Won't Always Be This Great, is fantastic. I was in the middle of reading it when we interviewed him. I've since finished it. It's absolutely hilarious. Everyone should go out and buy this book. Give it to a friend for Festivus or Hanukkah, Christmas, or just buy it for yourself, as I did. I couldn't wait for the holidays.
I purchased the Kindle edition, which I plan on reading over the holidays.
Yes, we'll include an Amazon link in our show notes so you guys can buy this book as soon as you're done listening to our interview. Now, just a heads up for everyone, we did record this interview via Skype, so we weren't lying. We did sit down with him. We were sitting when we recorded. But
we were all sitting, yes.
But,
no standing for this guy.
No, but the connection, of course, isn't as good as having someone in person. So please bear with the sound quality. It's a fantastic interview. You don't want to miss it. But what do you say, Vinny? Should we get to our interview with Peter Mehlman?
Giddy up.
Peter, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Great. Thanks again for joining us. Right out the gate, I wanted to talk a little bit about this book you've written. It's called It Won't Always Be This Great. Could you give us a quick premise of the book?
Yeah, it's a novel about a guy who's a podiatrist on Long Island. He's actually the narrator of the story, and he's recounting the story to his college roommate who happens to be in a coma. That's what kind of guy he is. He doesn't really go all the way with things, so, like he's kind of telling the story, but he's not really telling the story. He's even, kept a lot of it from his wife and everything. He's a guy who lives in a community on Long Island that has had a huge influx of Orthodox Jews, and, they kind of throw their economic weight around. Like if you open your store in town or on a Friday night or a Saturday, they will basically economically boycott you. He's a podiatrist, and he happens to be, a very reformed Jew. I'd say almost an atheistic Jew. Mm-hmm. And but on a Friday night, he stays at his podiatric office a little bit too late, and he can't really even be seen driving, or he would be economically frozen out. So he's forced to walk home 2 miles on a freezing cold night, and he trips on a bottle of horseradish on the ground and wrenches his ankle. And like me, he's a basketball player in his 50s, so every time you hurt your ankle, you think, well, that's it, I'll never play again. And he gets so angry that he kind of absently just throws the bottle, and it ends up going through the store window of a store that's owned by a very prominent Orthodox Jew in the town. And he is the kind of person who would normally go, oh my God, and pick up his phone and dial 911 and cop to what he did. But this one time, for some reason, he just says, no, I'm not doing it. And he walks away. And it becomes kind of like seen as a hate crime in his area, and it kind of explodes into a big controversy, and he keeps it to himself. And the story is about him and his family, and and what happens. And it's pretty comedic, but it's also a story about a guy who, this is like a whole new genre. He's actually a guy who's been married 24 years and is still crazy about his wife. He's still like worried that he's going to blow it with his wife.
Aww.
It's a little Seinfeldian, but not very. It's a lot more poignant than Seinfeld, and obviously if you put any poignancy into writing a Seinfeld episode, you'd get fired immediately. So that's pretty much probably why I did it.
I'm reading the book right now, and that's something that I think I went in with just an assumption, just a preconceived notion, knowing this is a novel, your first novel, that, we're going to get, hints of Seinfeld, or at least things that just being a fan of your work, I'm almost expecting. And I really was surprised. And in a sense, I'm drawn into the story a lot more because you, as a writer, are taking me down a very different path than I'm used to.
Yeah.
Was that sort of your, MO when you wanted to do your first novel? Like, I want to really challenge myself and go in a different direction? Or was this just something that kind of organically happened over the years?
Well, it organically happened, and, I didn't lay out the story or anything. In fact, I was probably 30 pages in before I realized I was writing a novel. And I didn't really have any philosophy for it or anything. It just kind of happened. Like at a certain point, maybe 45, 50 pages in, at one point I wrote a joke that the narrator says, at the expense of his wife. And I felt so bad about it because I liked her so much that I took it out. So, it was to me the best way of doing it, where it all just kind of comes organically and it's not planned out, and you hope the story ends up working out.
It seems like you might not have had a deadline for a novel like this, like you would for articles and TV episodes. Yeah,
that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Not having a deadline and not having anybody, standing over you waiting for your final product was a pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Although I ended up doing it fairly quickly. I mean, it only took me maybe 10 months.
Wow. And did your writing sessions, were you disciplined, or, just some days you're writing a little bit here, a little bit there, or did it kind of snowball over time?
I'm not disciplined at all, but I was enjoying doing this so much, and that, I kept on wanting to get back to it. But I did have one little philosophy of trying to make some progress every day, even if it was just one paragraph. And that's almost like tricking yourself, because, if your goal is to write one paragraph, chances are you're going to write more than that.
Sure.
Otherwise, no rules or anything. It's not like, like John Updike, would write 3,000 words a day. I could never keep to something like that.
Yeah. Well, I figured we could maybe go back a little bit here and talk just a little bit about your career, your life before Seinfeld. You grew up in Queens, is that right?
Yes.
All right. And then you went on to the University of Maryland.
Yes.
And the reason I bring that up specifically is because Vinnie here, Vinnie, you're from Maryland, right?
That's true. Born and raised.
Yeah. What drew you to the University of Maryland? Can you recall at the time?
Well, at first, I remember like one day in my junior year of high school playing basketball with my friends like I always did. And this is kind of in the book, actually. The book is completely fictional, and, it's not based on anyone, and none of the characters are based on anyone, but there are some autobiographical details in there. And one of them is I was playing basketball like I did absolutely every day after school, and in the middle of a game one day, I just kind of like stopped mid-stride and said to myself, I got to get out of here.
Mm.
So I wanted to go away to college. I don't know if I quite had the grades for the New York State schools, and in a way I didn't want to go to them because they're all so freezing cold.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, University of Maryland, like it seemed like the perfect school. It was, far enough away but not that far away, and it was like a big-time college school, and also I liked the fact that it was, 9 miles from Washington, D.C., which was a city I always kind of had liked seeing. So, I don't know, it just fit the bill perfectly.
You've mentioned a couple times that you're a basketball player and still are. Are you a tall gentleman, Peter?
I'm 6'1", but I have I had an incredible vertical leap.
6'1" will fly in the NBA. So I was just curious. I'm a 5'7" individual myself, so I need every inch I can get.
That means you got to work a little harder.
Thank you.
Peter, another reason why I brought up University of Maryland is we know Larry David went there. You guys were never there at the same time, though, right?
No, he's 10 years older than me.
Wow. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't find your birthday online. Otherwise, I wouldn't have asked that question.
That's okay.
Okay.
That's okay.
Well, after the University of Maryland, did you just launch right into this career working for the Washington Post, or were you sort of just finding your way in life as most postgraduates do?
Kind of both. For a while, for about a year, I was trying to figure things out, and I really wanted to get onto the Washington Post. It was kind of in the post-Watergate glow, and it was 1978, and I did, I wrote a lot for the student newspaper at the University of Maryland, and I then got a tip from somebody that I heard that the Washington Post was not hiring any white males. So I wrote a job letter to the managing editor of the paper, Howard Simons, as a woman. I used my friend's name, Faith Cates, and I wrote a really, really funny job letter. And the way things were back then, I actually got a letter back in the mail saying, we enjoyed your letter very much, and we do have a job opening with terrible hours, as a copy aide. I think it was Monday. It was 8 to 3 a.m. with Mondays and Tuesdays off. And, I wanted this job tremendously, but I didn't know what to do because they were expecting a woman. So I wrote another letter as me, explaining why I wrote the first letter, and then they just called me and they asked me to come in, and I got to meet with almost all of the big editors except for Ben Bradley, but almost all the big editors at the paper, and I got my foot in the door there.
Oh, that's incredible.
That could have been a George story, I think.
Yeah, now that you're saying it, I'm amazed that I never thought of that. That's really good. That would have been a really good story.
From interviews we've seen with you and commentaries that you've participated in on the DVDs, a lot of your writing for Seinfeld were just a lot of little ideas that sometimes all came together into a 22-minute episode.
Those are the ideas I like, and I think that was the original conception of the show. Which I really feel like amongst all the writers, I was more devoted to that original concept of the tiny stories, the little tiny slice of life and manners that Larry originally kind of envisioned for the show.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we can kind of go through your career through the 80s, you were a freelance magazine writer at one point, but I guess before that you worked with Howard Cosell on Sports Beat.
Yes.
Now, going through the 80s...
I had a dream about him last night.
Oh, did you?
I had a dream that I was in Los Angeles and I was still at that job. And, I just hadn't been going to work. I was just in Los Angeles, and I was like, what am I going to tell Howard? I just haven't been at work for 2 weeks.
Oh, my gosh. Did your time with him mean a lot?
Yes, it meant a tremendous amount. I made lifelong friends there, and completely changed my view of sports. I was a big sports fan, and when you're around Howard Cosell, you start seeing all the hypocrisy of sports, and in certain ways you don't enjoy it as much, but you feel better about it in a way. You're not. I think you become in a way a better sports fan.
Mm.
You roll your eyes at all this stuff about winning and losing and, the coaches and, then you see interviews on ESPN and, you can't believe how stupid the questions are. And so it had a really, really big impact on everything, just on the way I think. Cosell was an amazing guy.
Yeah. When you were working for Howard Cosell, and you enjoyed it so much, what took you from that to writing for various magazines like GQ, Esquire, the New York Times Magazine? What pulled you away from Sports Beat?
Well, the short answer is I got laid off. After 2.5 years, it was, about a few months after the '84 Olympics, ABC blew so much money on those Olympics that, around November, all of a sudden, there were massive cutbacks. And, working on Cosell's show was a very small staff, and nobody wanted to leave. And I was like third from the last as far as seniority was concerned, and they had to cut back. And I got laid off, and which was kind of a good thing. I think I did it about as much as I was going to do there. Mm-hmm. And, in a way, it's always good to get laid off as opposed to fired. Right.
A lot of people, for some reason, I know, don't know the difference between the two. Fired means you did something wrong. Laid off means they had no choice.
Yeah. Laid off was, but, it was the best thing for me in a way. It was like, because I consider working for Cosell and working for Seinfeld as kind of detours in my career. Because I always wanted to write full sentences. And, that's not something that you really did a lot of for Howard or for Jerry. Writing freelance, I was looking for jobs, but I happened to have one funny idea for an article that I sold to Mademoiselle magazine. And I was thinking, boy, this is fun. I could just write more of these things and keep going.
Specifically women's magazines?
I wrote a lot for women's magazines just because, which was kind of a precursor to Seinfeld in a way, because I wrote a lot about, relationship-y kind of stuff from a male point of view, but it was all jokes. The funny thing is people would take it like, a lot of women would take it like really seriously, like your article meant so much to me. And I was like, they asked me once at, I think, Harper's Bazaar if I could write something about redheads. And, I never even gave redheads much of a thought, but I wrote this kind of funny piece about redheads, and redheaded girls from all over the country are writing in letters saying, "Oh, you've helped my self-esteem so much."
Hey.
So I only knew that I was like a gun for hire and was doing it for the money. But
well, when you're writing for these magazines while you're freelancing, are you living in New York at the time? Are you in LA at this point?
I was living in New York from the time, and freelancing from the time I got laid off at the end of '84 to mid-1989, and then I moved to Los Angeles, where I was basically doing the same thing until Seinfeld. Okay, and I have to just be a little selfish here for a second, because I've lived in New York now for about 8 years, and I have, the short of it is I've fallen out of love with the city, the people, the commute, everything. I don't hate it. It's just not as, magical as it used to be for me. And I'm just itching to get to LA. Did you have a similar feeling at that time in the 80s? I didn't fall out of love with New York. I just needed a change. And, I had been to LA several times, and I always liked it, and I needed a change. I don't know. I was felt kind of stale, and I'd been through a breakup, and I don't know. I just needed kind of like to shake my life up a little bit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's almost like New York laid me off.
Well, it was sort of a good thing that you went to LA, because at this point you knew Larry David. You guys had met from time to time in New York, right?
A couple of times, yeah.
Now, since you're a writer, you weren't a stand-up comedian at the time, right?
Yeah.
So what circles were you meeting in? Was this just socially in bars, or was this through friends?
No, I had, like a quarter share in a Hamptons house in 1988. And Larry came out for a day as someone's guest. It might have even been Laurie David.
Oh.
Laurie, who was Laurie Leonard at the time, who was one of the people in my house. And Larry came out for a day, and, we we hung out and we got along, and then I remember like going to one other party and seeing him there.
Oh, interesting.
And we met those 2 times, and that was, and it was kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you flash forward to when you're in LA, you've been out there for a year.
Uh-huh.
Did your first encounter, your first step towards writing for Seinfeld, did it just come from a chance encounter with Larry?
Yes.
Wow.
It's all luck.
Mm.
I mean, when you get down to it, you got to get lucky.
What was the encounter? Was he like just offering you a job on Seinfeld at the time, or was he just sort of feeling things out with you at first?
No, he wasn't offering really anything. It was very casual. I forgot exactly where I bumped into him, but it was basically like, hey, I'm doing this little TV show with Jerry Seinfeld. Maybe you could write a script. I'm not even sure if Larry knew that I had never really written dialogue. And, so he asked me if I'd, give him a writing sample and that he would, pass it on to Jerry. And I didn't have a script, so I actually gave him an article that I had written in the New York Times. It was a humor piece, kind of, with a bit of a bittersweet edge to it, about a day in New York after a breakup where I spent the entire day walking around New York trying to spot a celebrity before I got home. Mm. My friends and I were great celebrity spotters, so I didn't know what to do with myself being alone at the time, so that's what I did for an entire day, and I wrote about it. And it was an article that got a huge amount of response in New York. I got like 85 letters to my home address within the next 5 days.
Gosh.
And I gave it to Larry, and he passed it on to Jerry, and Jerry somehow read it and took a shine to it and said, let's try to get him a script.
Right. Now, were you a little intimidated by the proposition of writing a sitcom? I mean, you had no experience with this up to this point. Were you kind of, faking it as you went along, or did you have friends that you could consult in order to, to get it down? Did you know what you were doing?
No, and that goes part and parcel with not being intimidated. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I didn't. But it was like a sitcom. I was thinking, how hard can this be? And I didn't get intimidated by the whole thing until I actually, started working on the show. My first season, like in the beginning, I was just not used to being around show business people. And, I was around mostly journalism people, and it's a completely different breed. And, I was trying to get the lay of the land and, figure out what people are like. And it was just very different. I have to say, there was a lot more sucking up and things like that. People were just not what I was used to. So I was very quiet during the first, half of my first season on Seinfeld. I actually put up a little note on my bulletin board that said, "Shut up and learn."
Peter, you hadn't come on board until season 2, correct? Where your first episode would be The Apartment?
Yes.
But did you have a chance to see the first season? And if so, what did you think of it?
When they invited me in to, pitch ideas to the show after reading the New York Times article, they gave me cassettes of the first, 3 episodes. And I saw them, and all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, this is really good. That was like a little bit like, oh my God, this is something I might really like doing, because this show is just great. And so that was a little scary, but now I've completely lost track of what your question was.
Oh, just had you seen you seen episodes prior?
Yeah, I was kind of blown away.
So after seeing those episodes, were you, approaching this offer to write an episode? Did you have all these ideas like, oh my gosh, I could totally, bring a lot to the table, or did Larry and Jerry give you, a few ideas to run with?
I came in with an idea, and I talked to them about it, and Larry Charles, one of the, was one of the other writers, well, really the only writer on the staff practically, was there, and he gave a suggestion about the idea that really helped it, and so we had this one idea of, Jerry kind of thoughtlessly telling Elaine that there's an open apartment in her building, and suddenly realizing what it would be like to have your ex-girlfriend living in your building. And, I remember I said during the meeting, it would be like, you'd have to have all of your sex in the woman's apartment. You'd lose the home bed advantage. And, Larry loved that. And then they basically said, okay, go ahead and write it. So I didn't even have any other stories except that. Mm-hmm. So the whole story that goes on in there about George wearing a wedding ring to see whether it would really attract women, and going to a New York Marathon party, that stuff was all like, they didn't know any of that was going to be in the script when I wrote it. So that's kind of like what I mean about the freedom that I got from having complete ignorance about things. I wrote very loose and really enjoyed it. And the more and more I knew about this stuff, the less freedom I wrote with, and so it took a long time to kind of balance all that out.
I got the vibe that they didn't really know exactly what the show was going to be, and it was thanks to writers like you who were bringing something new to the table that really helped form it to become what is now, a show we're talking about 18 years after it's ended, or 16 years after it's ended. Did you collaborate a lot with Larry and Jerry for the most part, or would you say most of the heavy lifting done by you as a writer?
Well, there was a lot of collaboration, but it was, very informal collaboration. I would just wander over to Larry Charles and say, what do you think about this? Or, Larry would be on the set during, camera blocking, and I just mosey down to the set and watch a little rehearsal and say to Larry, what do you think of this? And, so it was very collaborative in that way, but it wasn't collaborative in the way of most sitcoms where, you're all basically put into this one room that's like a prison cell and you're shouting jokes at each other and completely homogenizing the product. So, it was a very loose situation. It was loosely structured. The great thing I think that made the show is that Larry and Jerry didn't really know what they were doing. They'd never done a sitcom before, so they didn't do it like anyone else.
And of course, now in hindsight, looking back, it all makes sense. You can follow this linear path from the first episode to the last episode, and you're like, this is brilliant. They knew what they were doing the whole time, but it goes to show.
Actually, I would say, that the path of the show kind of followed Larry's creative evolution. At first it would be one story or two stories tops. Kramer would barely ever leave the building, and there would be all this time for completely off-the-subject conversations. Those conversations about, who's your favorite explorer or ugliest world leaders, that stuff was great, but it started getting to be less and less of the show as years went on because, Larry would kind of all of a sudden he would discover this thing about connecting all the storylines, and then that would become part of the show. So then there would be, Kramer started getting out more, and you started wanting to have 3 and 4 storylines going at once and connecting them. So, it kind of followed this path of Larry's evolution as far as creativity is concerned. Keeping up with him was really tough.
Now, I think I might have tweeted you personally from my own Twitter or our show's Twitter, but we heard from Jason Alexander in one of the interviews on the DVD that he referred to a writer's room. And what immediately popped into my mind was sort of what you just mentioned, this big table, all these writers sit around, they have a huge dry erase board, and they're just throwing jokes around until an episode forms. Did you write at the studio, or were you typically writing at your own house, or how did that work?
Oh, I wrote at the studio in my office.
Mm-hmm.
But, basically with the door closed in my, alone.
Peter, are you a laptop guy or a computer guy, or were you writing, freehand, pen and paper, which I think Jerry and Larry were known for?
Jerry and Larry Charles. But no, I was a computer guy right from the beginning. I was writing on computers at the Washington Post in 1980.
Oh, wow.
So, I was a long-time computer writer.
Okay. And do you carry your idea? I know you're also known for having these little ideas that get inserted to a show and end up becoming these wonderful jokes that people remember. Do you write those down in a little pad that you carry with you?
Constantly.
Okay.
Now I put them on my iPhone.
Doesn't seem the same, does it?
No, it doesn't. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember I got to check out what I wrote down on my iPhone. It's not the same as having a pad and like pulling it out of your pants pocket every night.
Now, there's an episode of Seinfeld that we covered on our show that was never made called The Bet. Now, we know this is a Larry Charles pitched idea, but since this is such a, like this lost episode of sorts, do you have any recollection on like the attitude with that show, that episode in particular? And were there any other episodes that, were developed and then were scrapped at some point?
I'm not sure which episode of Larry's you're talking about. Was that the one with the Moyle?
Oh, I'm sorry. No,
this was the Briss. The Bet is the one in which Elaine is going to get a handgun.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, there were plenty of ideas that, go ahead and write it, and it didn't go. For various reasons. Sometimes the script just didn't work. But other times, like I had written one script, when Larry got into these kind of the continuing storylines in season 4, where, there was kind of an arc to the whole season. I had been writing one script and I finished it, and they really liked it, and yet a couple of the storylines were rendered moot by what had happened before. So, and there were episodes that, just didn't make it, or, there was like a clash of sensibility. I had written one later, much later, called The Harvard Man, about the way people from Harvard, dropped the fact that they went to Harvard within like 2 seconds of conversation. And that was after Larry was gone. That was my final season, and that was season 8. And I don't know, Jerry just didn't get it or like it. And, it never ran. Like, a lot of the other writers really liked it. And of course, a lot of the other writers were from Harvard. And, I don't know, that was just something that wasn't in Jerry's wheelhouse somehow.
That's actually a topic that we love discussing on Seinfeld, is things that are on the cutting room floor, or ideas that never really made it, at whatever point in the writing process. In addition to The Harvard Man, can you shed some light on other ideas that you had that didn't necessarily make it, or that you believed very strongly in, and Larry or Jerry or somebody just said, this isn't going to work?
One thing that was really funny is I had the idea of the shower head, about being forced to switch to low-flow shower heads and everybody's hair being flattened out. And Larry and Jerry kind of rejected that idea about 3 or 4 times, and I had gotten to the point of being confident enough to just keep repitching it, saying, I'm sorry, but this is really funny. This is a really good idea. I'm pitching it again. So that was one that was like that. It finally did make it. And, there were others that I'm sure I pitched that did that, I thought there was something there, and they didn't take a shine to it. I did a whole thing about high thread count sheets that somehow didn't make it. In the first few years, there were tons of ideas that weren't making it. And I think as time went on, the parameters loosened so much that a lot of ideas that wouldn't have made it in season 4, that wouldn't have seen the light of day, ended up being on episodes later on, and a lot of times I was kind of disgusted by that, just, I didn't like the big shows. Like doing an entire show revolving around the Puerto Rican Day Parade was just like, I didn't even want to, have my name on it.
Mm-hmm. We always actually like to break down the seasons, 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9. 1 through 3 are so grounded in reality, everyday conversation, the etiquette in society about things, how are you supposed to act in these social situations. 4 to 6 is when the show really hits its stride. It's got this nice mix of, being grounded in reality with like a hint of zany. And then 7 through 9 is when it just gets outlandish at times. And it does find its own voice, but it's just completely different than where the show started.
Right.
But is that kind of what you're referring to with the Puerto Rican Day Parade?
Yeah. I mean, that's just, and, like making salads in the sink. I mean, I wasn't even there then, but, I'm not that up on a lot of the things that happened in the final episode, but, like in, Kramer being a turkey or whatever, I didn't see that, and, those things, I just didn't like those kind of episodes. That's part of the reason I left when I did, because my last episode as a staff writer was Yada Yada. And, Yada Yada is like a throwback episode. It's very small. Right. All the stories are tiny little slices of life. And, I was very happy to leave on that kind of note.
Well, could we talk about your role in the series as a whole? You started off as you weren't a staff writer initially with the apartment. Were you considered like just like a freelance writer, or how did that start?
Yeah, at that point, it was a freelance script. I wasn't, I remember, like after we shot that show, late in the evening, on shoot night, Larry sidled over to me and said, if we get picked up next season, you got a job. Yeah, but all those job titles don't really mean anything.
Peter, I work in TV, and I'm starting to realize that sometimes a job title can just say more about what you're getting paid as opposed to how important you are.
That is exactly what it is.
But
basically doing the same job.
Sure. Now, you're starting off as a freelance writer, though. You did get a eventual title of executive producer, or was it co-executive producer?
Yeah, co-executive producer.
Okay, and why? Jumping ahead real quick, why did you choose to leave the show at the time? Were you interested in your own, personal pursuits, or was it? Did you have issues with where the show was going now that Larry was off?
No, I left because, well, A, like I said, I thought that was a good episode to leave on, and B, I knew that the next season was going to be the last one, and I didn't want to be one of, 10 Seinfeld writers pitching new shows. So I thought I'd, get out a little bit earlier.
You hit that high note.
Like my last season on the show after Larry was gone, there was, the process became a little bit more like being on another sitcom. There was a lot more group writing going on, and that just wasn't for me. So it would just seem like a perfect time to take my DreamWorks deal, which I had put off 3 times, and start creating my own show.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting though, as we're just breaking the show down, how you tend to notice. You had maybe a handful of writers in those early seasons, and then by the time you got to the later seasons, it's almost like every other episode was like a different writer. Like you said, you went through about 10 of them until you came back to one of your scripts. Or
I mean, there were a lot of names on every script. There would be 3 story by 3 guys, written by 3 other guys, or 2 other writing teams. So yeah, it did change a lot.
Well, Peter, I know we're running a little bit longer than we initially discussed, but I figured we had a few questions about specific episodes that you wrote. Nothing too crazy here. We just have some of our favorites. Oh, great!
All right,
I'll stop with the setup there. Well, we wanted to first talk about the episode "The Visa." mainly because the last episode that we discussed on our show was the cafe, which introduced the Babu Bhatt character. And we noticed just in the run of the show, Babu Bhatt is the first character that comes back, that we see again, has somewhat of an ongoing storyline, similar to someone like Newman or Putty or whoever. That idea of bringing Babu Bhatt back, was that something you wanted to do? Did you like this character, or did that come from higher up?
That came from higher up.
Mm-hmm. Can you recall at all why they chose to do this? Because it seems like the writers on Seinfeld were so good at creating new characters, creating totally original characters, and just sort of paving a new road, a new direction to go in. Do you know why they wanted to bring him back exactly?
Well, I had this idea of Jerry being out of town and Elaine getting his mail and being really slow about bringing it back, so of getting the mail to him. And so, we were trying to figure out what would be a good consequence of that, what would be an important letter. And I would have preferred that it would have been a letter that, would have, inconvenienced Jerry himself a lot. But, nothing really inconvenienced Jerry a lot. And then I guess the idea of having it, being Babu and having him be deported because Elaine didn't get the mail to Jerry fast enough was kind of funny.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in a way, it makes no sense because why wouldn't Kramer get the mail since he's in the building? But I always liked Elaine being having a very strong part in all the episodes. I thought it was basically impossible to write a great episode unless if Elaine wasn't having a strong part.
Peter, you've also said in commentaries that you found it easier or maybe more enjoyable to write for Elaine, as well as Jerry, versus other writers on the show who found a much easier time writing for George and Kramer. What is it about writing for a woman, or Elaine in particular, that you found most enjoyable?
Well, a lot of it was kind of similar to what I was writing, for women's magazines. So... And, Jerry and Elaine were more grounded people, especially in the beginning. They were fairly normal, well-adjusted people. And George and Kramer were much more extreme characters, especially Kramer. I enjoyed writing for George and everything. Kramer, I had no problem writing for him, but coming up with ideas for him was a very difficult thing for me. It took me a long time to come to a sudden realization that I could take a story that I have pegged for Jerry and go, hey, what if I just gave this story to Kramer? And then, because usually for Kramer stories you would think of something big and physical.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I was getting in trouble. But when I realized I could give like a tiny little Jerry story and maybe give it to Kramer, like the thing where he's got a low sperm count and has to switch to boxers, that was originally an idea I thought was good for Jerry because it was a very normal problem.
Mm-hmm.
But, once you give it to Kramer, you let Michael's acting go and, he takes it to the higher place. You don't have to, make it into this big physical thing. He does it himself. So, I did basically really like writing for Jerry and Elaine because their stories were smaller and more grounded.
Speaking of a story grounded, Jerry and Elaine getting together at the end of season 2 in The Deal, that came down from the network, right, to get these two together?
I think so.
Okay. I know...
I wasn't on staff then, but I do consider that scene when they negotiate their deal to be probably like the greatest comedy writing I've ever seen on TV.
Okay. You're wholeheartedly agree.
You're referring to the this, that, and the other.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, I know Larry was vehemently opposed to having the two get together, and he had to kind of cave in a way to at least satisfy the network. But what are your thoughts on the two of them ending up together at some point?
Well, like I said, I absolutely loved that episode, but when we came back the next season and, Larry was saying, well, what do you think? Should they be together or not? I was immediately opposed to them being together because it would limit the amount of dating stories I could do. Mm. Jerry dating stories, in a way, was my life's blood there. And Elaine, if they're not together, if they're together, I don't have the implant. I don't have, the sponge, there's like a million episodes where I lose out. So, I did not want them together because I just thought it would be too limiting.
I'm always blown away by the writing of the deal, only because on paper, or just pitching you the idea of getting these two together turns me off so much. It just doesn't feel right. But leave it to Larry to actually make it work in a way. It's just incredible, like how you can how you can do that.
And it's also the idea itself is like a total signpost of what the show is about. Which was these people trying to create a perfect world. These people always trying to beat the system. And, I love those kind of stories where, they're trying to do the impossible.
We're really fascinated by the fact that the network wasn't as present, maybe, or as overbearing as one would really expect on a sitcom. Can you just maybe walk us through, like, how the network got involved, or what their influence was on the writing? Did it happen a lot, or was it pretty rare?
What happened was that, the people who were normally in charge of sitcoms were not very interested in the show in the beginning, right from the get-go. And Rick Ludwin, who was an executive in charge of late night and specials, he was like in charge of The Tonight Show and things like that. He loved the show, and he offered to take it under his budget. So instead of having a show where we were getting our notes and our feedback from the head of comedy and the head of primetime scheduling, like Jamie Tarsis was, we were getting all of our notes from Rick Ludwin. And Rick was not used to doing these things, so most of the time his notes, we'd have a table read, and they'd say, Rick, you got any thoughts? And he'd go, look, great script. He didn't feel that need to kind of justify his job by giving a lot of notes. So we got almost no network notes. Most of the notes we got were from Castle Rock executive team, Glenn Padnick. So, it was very unique in that way. The show really, I always say that, for a show to be successful, you have to dodge like 1,000 landmines. So, not having network people there was a huge landmine.
Yeah, I feel like it seems like the show almost avoided the majority of the landmines, almost like they went through the back door to get
Well, that's
on NBC.
Exactly right. And, the fact of the matter is, if a good show succeeds, that's an example of a show falling through the cracks. When a good show doesn't work and is canceled, that's not falling through the cracks. It's when it succeeds that it's fallen through the cracks. Because, in a way, the network is there to basically ruin your show.
Someone would call that a cynical look. I think that's entirely accurate. without a doubt.
Obviously it's easy pickings, knocking networks and what they do. But, it's basically the truth. I remember once saying to Jerry, I go, I think the network people, they spend their entire day just thinking to themselves, how can we get around this quality problem? And Jerry was like, that's it. That's exactly the entire thought of the entire network. They figured it out with reality TV,
Yeah, I've unfortunately taken a few jobs in reality TV just because it's unfortunately what's hiring most of the time. But I'm hoping that there'll be some sort of renaissance in entertainment TV. But I don't know. As long as it keeps making the executives money, I don't think they really care.
Well, I'm not really that up on what the scene is now, to tell you the truth.
You're lucky.
Yeah.
So I have another question regarding another episode you wrote, Peter, The Masseuse. You mentioned in the commentary that you were having trouble getting started during that season, and you're actually a little down because you hadn't had an episode get on air yet. Can you talk a little bit about what turned you around?
That whole season, I mean, like I had a fairly successful season, but, I never felt like I got that like I really turned it around that season. I don't know why. It was just, the one thing that did help me and kind of like, just got me off and going is I think Larry saw that I was, like struggling and upset about it. And he said to me, he goes, look, just take it easy. What do you, I don't care if you don't have any episodes on this season. I don't care. It's no big deal. Whatever. Just take it easy. Don't be so, and that was like the perfect thing to say. And I'd say if anything kind of, got me going, it was that.
This was season 5, so you're credited with The Masseuse and The Hamptons. Were you the solo writer on The Hamptons?
No, I was credited with Carol Leifer.
Carol Leifer.
I know together.
Right. Now, was that your first time collaborating with another writer on this show specifically?
Yes.
Now, do you, in a situation like that, I'm sure it varies episode by episode, but is your preferred writing method to, literally sit down with them, talk back and forth, or do you each take a pass on a script or collaborate? How does that work?
Well, it works in different ways depending on who you're writing with, but, that one we worked kind of together in a room, in my office, and, I was typing and I was writing and, then we go, we need a line here, or, we need a plot point here, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
There was a wealth of material in that episode. I mean, it was, having the ugly baby idea was great, and having this girl go topless was great, and it was just that was mainly just a matter of organizing it. I later wrote an episode. Actually, after I left, I did the Backward episode with Dave Mandel, and I was not part of the show then, but I came up with that idea, and I just came back and I felt like writing it with somebody just because I couldn't give it like as much attention as I would have when I was on staff. So me and Dave basically just talked and laughed, and then we were like, you want to write the scenes A, B, C, and D, and I'll write D, and yeah, sure, whatever. I mean, we really did kind of complete that one in an effortless way. It was really just fun, and it was, it was a pretty big episode.
Jumping to season 7 and your episode, The Sponge, something about that episode, we've had the contest. We have another episode you wrote called The Implant, where you're dealing with, topics. I don't want to just say it's sex, but it's topics that I would think the network would be maybe a little concerned about. Not necessarily hot button, but this idea of sex being talked about in mixed company, specifically women's birth control. That, I don't know if this is too strong a word. I find that personally very progressive for a sitcom to be able to talk about that. We're talking about one of the biggest shows on TV at the time. Was this something that you personally wanted to talk about, kind of relating this to writing, for women's magazines and the Elaine character? Was this something that you felt like should be out there, or is it just something that, hey, this is funny to me?
Yeah, it's just all about being funny. And I don't know why. I know that's kind of like if there were two themes that ran through some of my scripts, it was birth control, because I did a whole run about a diaphragm in the Virgin episode. And then, this isn't exactly birth control, but the one about the low sperm count is kind of another thing. And then The Sponge was like the ultimate. And, then I had another one basically about people completely changing their appearance and things like that. The implant was that, the nose job and I feel like there was one other. But that was kind of gratifying because it was a sensibility, and I got it in there, and the implant was probably a lot dicier than the sponge because by the time the sponge rolled around, the show was just so huge that we get away with anything. And once you've done an episode once you've done 22 minutes on masturbation, you could pretty much get away with anything. Part of it, is a credit to Larry that he was able to kind of pull these things off in a very, very, very subtle way. Obviously the contest is handled in a very deft way with the actual word never being stated. So, if you hint at it as opposed to knock the audience over the head with it, you have a better chance of it, getting by.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of our last episodes that we're going to talk about here is the yada yada, which you brought up earlier. This is, I think, one of the biggest examples of your I don't want to call them catchphrases, but the Seinfeld terminology that has entered the lexicon in such a big bad way that I almost want to give credit to you as a writer for coming up with the term yada yada, but it did originate before you wrote the episode, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. The first time I had ever heard about it was 10 years earlier. I was having lunch in New York with one of my editors. It's actually a new editor. And she said yada yada a couple of times. And I said, God, I never heard that. That's kind of funny. And, and I really thought about it again. And then it kind of came back to me years later. And I was thinking, boy, you say that yada yada, you can cover up all kinds of sins with it. And that's how the episode came about.
Did you ever have, when you were writing, the intention of, coming up with a slogan, catchphrase, what have you, that, this is really going to be a big hit? I know people are going to love this. Shrinkage comes to mind, sponge-worthy.
No, I never. Just looking to put a word to something, to put a term to something. And the funny thing is, the only time I ever kind of had the thought that, oh, wow, this might catch on after I'd written something was anti-dentite in yada yada. And I said, oh, God, this could be a big thing, anti-dentite. Without having any idea that it would be yada yada, that would go for crazy. So you can't really make up you can't really, I don't think you could have consciously thought, oh, I'm going to, come up with a catchphrase today.
Oh, yeah. Well, it seems like the most popular things out there were completely unintentional, or, your intentions were just as strong for something that didn't catch on. It's whatever sticks.
Yeah. I mean, and it wasn't even something I was, it wasn't even something you would want to aspire to doing that much. It was nice when it happened, but, it wasn't something gee, it would be great to come up with another catchphrase or anything like that. I was much more gratified by, even in the Backwards episode, there's one moment where Jerry and George are just walking down the street, and George says, yeah, God, what a day. It's the kind of day that makes it feel like it's almost good to be alive. And Jerry goes, yeah, almost. And, that kind of little couplet there was more of the thing that I would have been aspiring to than anything. Those little lines are what I really liked.
Doing this show, we rarely talk a lot about these terms or these catchphrases that have entered the lexicon. We really focus on these little moments, almost the moments that I think the casual fan don't even notice or don't even recall. It's something like the example you just gave that really, I think, have us keep coming back to the show time and time again.
Yeah, well, one of the first lines when I was watching those original few episodes, there's one moment where George says, I've never really had a meeting where I wanted the other person to show up. Mm. And I was thinking, oh my God, that's the greatest line. And, that was the kind of line that just made me think, wow, this is greatness right here.
Yeah. That was obviously a Larry, David, or Jerry Seinfeld script, something they collaborated on.
That was the Larry line.
Do you
Larry
have?
didn't even like that line, actually.
Oh, really?
That's what Larry told me.
Did you have any like favorite episodes from the series as a whole that, as a cog in this machine, were you looking at other writers like, oh my gosh, that's a fantastic episode, just one of my favorites?
Oh, yeah. But, it was more about specific ideas that did that to me. It was an outside writer who had come up with the idea of George just doing the opposite. Whatever his instinct was, doing the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
I love that idea so much, and at the same time, I was, just completely annoyed that I didn't come up with it myself. There were a few ideas that came up that others came up with that I totally admired and totally was annoyed that I didn't do it, that I didn't come up with that. I think that's kind of like my basketball training. I'm like super competitive about that kind of thing.
Peter, since leaving the show and going on to write novels and doing all these other things that you're working on, have you ever been approached or been interested in collaborating with members of the cast or writing staff, or even participating in Curb Your Enthusiasm in any way?
No, not really. When Jason did one of the shows that he did, he was on a show that was actually modeled on Tony Kornheiser, who was a writer for the Washington Post, who was kind of like my mentor back then. So they asked me if I would be involved, and I wasn't really that interested. A couple of times, Michael was, we should get together and do a show, but not really. I was never really, was involved in Curb or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I kind of like being on my own. Like if I don't have to, the great thing about Seinfeld and my DreamWorks deal is that it's kind of economically freed me up to, do whatever I want and not feel like I have to be obligated to, have a job.
The direction you're going in, from writing for Washington Post to working with Howard Cosell, the sitcoms, you had your own, you had 2 original series, It's Like and Father of the Bride. And now you're writing a novel. Is there another avenue you want to go? Do you like novel writing for now, or are you just trying to feel things out?
I like novel writing, but I'm always feeling things out. Actually, I've actually done stand-up a few times recently for the first time. I've done it 3 times in my life now, and, I really find that that's kind of fun. So, I don't know. I never really know exactly what's next.
What was stand-up? Were you in L.A. at the time, or was this in New York?
No, in New York. In L.A.
In L.A.? And
was all in the last few months.
Was it a good experience?
It was a great experience. It was fantastic.
Any plans to come to New York? Because we'd love to see you.
I have no plans. No,
Okay.
You're not going to advertise it.
I have no plans for the next time when I get on stage anywhere. I actually probably have to pursue that, which is, I don't know. But I don't know. It was just like a really interesting experience, and I feel like in a way I was kind of cheating because I don't have that much at stake. So I wasn't really nervous at all. Like writing a novel, and if everybody thought it was terrible, that would have been really bad. But, if I kind of bombed on stage doing stand-up, I was like, all right, so at least I tried it. But I didn't. It went great. And I was really, and it's really kind of, it's on my mind more than I would have thought it would be.
Did you have a lot of material that you had written down previously or rehearsed as like a polished product, or did you just go up there with the intent to improvise or tell stories or do crowd work?
No crowd work. No acknowledgement that they're even there.
Okay.
And when I started doing it, when I started thinking about it, I started kind of like doing it in the shower a little bit. So it was, it was somewhat thought out. But, it's kind of weird because, I'm so completely out of style as far as what the rest of the comedians seem to be like. Everybody's like super high energy and observational, and, I'm super low energy and really a little bit more fantastical.
Well, I think stand-up comedy is one of the most terrifying things anyone could do or attempt to do. And even more terrifying is trying to make a career out of it, pursuing it. But, maybe when, as you put it, you didn't really have that much at stake by going up. It must have been in a way liberating, I would think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's that, in that Seinfeld episode when George is pretending that he was an architect, and he and the girl says, and he says, my most recent project was the new wing of the Guggenheim, and the girl says, you did that? And he goes, yeah, didn't even take that long. That's how I feel about stand-up. I feel like, yeah, well, it's not that hard. It's actually pretty easy. I don't see what the big deal is.
Yeah.
It's actually a very nice philosophy to have, maybe a way to oversimplify life, the anxieties I face on a daily basis. So
yeah, I mean, I think everybody, every time I hear somebody say what you just said about, stand-up comedy being one of the most terrifying things to do, I'm always like, do you really feel that way, or is that just what you've heard? Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem to be, it's not that hard.
I think Vinny and I might need to give an open mic night a shot then.
Oh, no.
So we can actually speak about it from a personal experience.
They always introduce me as, in Seinfeld, whatever. So they, I guess the audience has like certain expectations, which I totally go completely against, which is good,
Well, I'm personally enjoying that very much, reading your book. It's really a treat getting to experience a different side of you as a writer, a different voice, just a different direction in general, because we have all of these Seinfeld episodes, of course, to fall back on. But I love seeing the new directions that you're paving for yourself as a writer. I think it's just fantastic. And Peter, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This was just an absolute treat for both of us.
Thank you, Peter, very much.
My pleasure, absolutely.
Just to ask, though, where can our listeners keep up to date with you? Do you have a website, Twitter?
I have all those things. I'm very modern. I have a website, pmehlman.com, PMEHLMAN.com, and I'm on Twitter as Peter Mehlman. You know what? I tweeted one tiny little comment today about a trade in the NBA, and it got retweeted like 1,000 times. So it's like I sometimes I'll put like a one-line joke on there that I think is pretty funny, and it gets nothing. And then you make one joke about a trade in the NBA, and the whole place explodes. And I totally don't get this, but but I'm doing it. I'm there.
It's the world we live in.
And you get these followers like from the middle of nowhere. Somebody will follow you, and they have like, and you look at how many followers they have like, it says 93K. Like, what?
Wow.
I have 680 followers, and this guy in the middle of like northern Minnesota, has 43 million followers. So I don't get the whole thing, but I'm along for the ride.
Hey, we're right there with you. We don't get it ourselves, and it's baffling, but.
It's so amazing. Yeah. One little thing about the NBA that'll like triple your followers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Peter, again, thank you so much. Peter is the author of It Won't Always Be This Great, which you can find anywhere. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Take care, guys.
Well, that was great, man, getting a chance to talk to Peter Mehlman.
What an absolute treat and pleasure to have somebody from the guide. No, to have somebody from Seinfeld, somebody who was integral to the show we love so dearly, and he took an hour out of his day to talk with us. Yeah, and he couldn't have been nicer.
He couldn't have been nicer. We are huge Peter Mehlman fans. It was just an absolute pleasure and an honor to have him on here. It's weird to think back to 10 years ago, Vinny. You and I were at Michigan State University watching the first season DVD and seeing these interview clips of Peter Mehlman, and we're like, who is this guy? Like, such a surreal experience as we're talking to him. So we wanted to put this together as a sort of a Festivus treat for our listeners, because you guys have been so supportive of our show. We love each and every one of you. We hope you have a wonderful Festivus. If you know anyone that ever worked on Seinfeld, either as an actor or a crew member, someone that delivered bagels, H&H, reach out to us. Let us know, because we'd really like to start interviewing more people, and maybe once a month having a new interview with someone affiliated with the show. Maybe it could start turning into every 2 weeks. Who knows? Depends on how many people are willing to talk to us. So, hey, if you know of anyone, let us know. We'll do our part and try to find them ourselves. But there you go.
I guess that just about does it.
I think so, Vinny. Happy Festivus.
Happy Festivus, buddy.
Seincast is not endorsed by Castle Rock Entertainment, Sony Pictures, or NBC, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. The official Seinfeld site can be found at sonypictures.com/TV/Seinfeld. Seinfeld, the Seinfeld logo, and all names, pictures, and audio of Seinfeld characters are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Castle Rock Entertainment, or their respective trademark and copyright holders.
Frank, no offense, but this holiday's a little out there.
Kramer, you can't go. Who's going to do the Feats of Strength?
How about George?
Good thinking, Cougar. Until you pin me, George, Festivus is not over.
Oh, please, somebody stop this.
Let's rumble!
I think you can take him, Georgie.
Hey, come on, be sensible.
Stop crying and fight your father.
Ow! Ow, I got it!
This is the best Festivus ever!